Have you ever wondered why the Atlantic slave trade is not taught fully in schools? Throughout history, there has been a persistent global phenomenon of mistreating individuals as property, depriving them of their rights. However, the Atlantic slave trade is particularly noteworthy for its extensive reach and legacy. Were you aware that from 1500 to 1880 CE, an estimated 10 to 12 million individuals of African descent were forcibly transported to the Americas as slaves, and that roughly 15% of them perished during the journey? The statistics associated with this trade are staggering, and what's more important is understanding the impact of this dark chapter in human history. Join us as we delve into the untold stories of the Atlantic slave trade and learn from its legacy. Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, Congo and Angola, were the primary sources of enslaved Africans, and the Middle Passage that traversed the Atlantic brought 12.4 million slaves to various destinations. Slaves in the Americas were treated as commodities and sold at marketplaces akin to livestock. Upon purchase, they were commonly branded on the cheek like cattle. The living conditions of slaves were characterized by fear and hard labor. One historian summarized it succinctly: the idea that I am not human, but I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse, nothing. Slavery, violence, and injustice have been recurring themes throughout human history. For countless years, the widespread custom of enslaving others has persisted on a global scale. European slave traders abducted millions of Africans and subjected them to inhumane conditions during the transatlantic journey. In the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain expanded into the New World and compelled indigenous peoples to work on plantations. Many of these Indian slaves died from European diseases and invasion. As a solution to their labor shortage, Europeans turned to Africa, resulting in numerous Portuguese and Spanish expeditions to the continent. Consequently, Africa became a significant source of slaves for European nations, the Spanish West Indies and Portuguese territories in Brazil. The arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of a drastic change for Africans. Once farmers, traders, fighters, musicians, goldsmiths, and blacksmiths, they lost their identity and occupation. They were not just professionals, but also husbands, dads, spouses, children, and mothers with roots in their communities. The Europeans conquered their communities and captured them, shipping them off to Europe on large vessels. The European slavers then spread them throughout America and Europe, where they were subjected to terrible conditions, stripped, flogged, and forced to work long hours in poor weather and health. They suffered tremendously. The transatlantic slave trade was responsible for sending between 10 to 12 million black Africans to the Americas. The triangular trade played a significant role in this event, which we will discuss in detail later. Before 1526, Europeans were already selling Africans as slaves. Even earlier, European explorers had enslaved American natives before 1518. However, Spanish kings initially refused to import African slaves from Africa, believing that they would ruin European civilization and introduce pagan and non-Christian behaviors. This changed when King Charles V awarded Lorenzo de Gorovad a license on August 18, 1518, to bring 4,000 African slaves directly to Spanish-American territories. After this, King Charles amended his grandparents' edict, allowing African slaves to be taken to Spanish territories in America if they were converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic. This led to an explosion in the number of slaves being transported from Africa to America. European slave traffickers imprisoned the slaves in African coast forts and carried them across the Atlantic. Due to the prevalence of malaria, they seldom raided sub-Saharan Africa, so most of the transatlantic slaves were Central and West Africans, captured by West Africans and sold to Western European slave traders. The triangular trade route was essential for European colonies in America, as they relied on slaves for their plantations. Despite objections, we will continue to share stories like this one. Let's delve into the triangular trade route, which was the Atlantic trade arrangement involving Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The route involved shipping arms, clothes, and wine to Africa and, in return, transporting African slaves to the Americas and West Indies. American plantations sent back sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton to Europe, thus completing the triangle. Europe provided financing, Africa provided labor, and America contributed land and resources, ensuring a constant supply for Europe. The transatlantic slave trade had a significant impact on everyone on the three continents, especially those in the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the route used to transport slaves, which was a grueling and often deadly journey lasting 3 to 6 months, depending on the weather. Many ships lost both slaves and crew due to harsh conditions. the mortality rate of slave ship sailors was 20%. The ships used in the transatlantic slave trade varied in design and passenger capacity, but they were all brutal. African slaves were cramped below deck in tight spaces and rarely saw the sun. They were required to dance to preserve their health and posture, and the decks they lived on were covered in filth, dung, and urine. According to a 1794 study, men had 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches of space, and women had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches of space. Women were even smaller, with a measurement of 4 feet by 6 inches by 1 foot. The living conditions on the slave ships were unbearable. The decks were hot and stale, and the air smelled of filth and human excrement. The slaves were hungry and thirsty, with only 24 ounces of water per day, which is equivalent to 2 12-ounce Coke cans. Their diet consisted mainly of horse beans and rice, and they were shackled and stacked below deck. They faced the additional challenges of battling pirates and pandemic illnesses during their journey, while also enduring physical, sexual, and mental abuse from slave traffickers and crewmen. Historians estimate that between 15 to 25% of enslaved Africans did not survive the journey to the Americas. The slave coast encompassing Togo, Benin, and Nigeria gained notoriety for its high volume of slave trade, where West Central African slaves were predominant. As the demand for slaves grew, the Portuguese resorted to forcibly capturing Africans from their interior regions of Africa. During the 1690s, 30,000 individuals were transported out of Africa annually, and a century later, this number rose to 85,000. Between 1700 and 1850, approximately 80% of Africans were enslaved. Between 1821 and 1830, 80,000 Africans made the voyage across the Atlantic to Africa. And over the following 20 years, more than 1 million followed until the slave trade was abolished. By 1820, for every European, around 4 Africans were transported over the Atlantic, and 4 out of 5 women were of African origin. Between 1720 and 1780, British North America received the majority of enslaved Africans. While Angolans were taken to Brazil, West Africans were sent to North America and the Caribbean. In 1825, only 6% of African captives were transported to British North America. Yet the U.S. accounted for 25% of Western Hemisphere Africans. Although American slavery differed significantly from U.S. slavery, in the following year, former President John Quincy Adams won a case in the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of the Amistad rebels. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling, and 35 Africans were repatriated home, thanks to private and missionary donations. In January 1842, 5 missionaries and professors launched a Christian mission in Sierra Leone. Europeans initiated the Atlantic slave trade, and Africans also participated by abducting adults and selling children as slaves. The captives were from different ethnic groups, were sold for goods or guns by European brokers. Some were criminals and thieves sold by African rulers to protect their communities, while others were captured in conflicts by ethnic groups and Europeans. These slaves were deemed as others and had no identity. Bernal Ibsen's Daughters of the Trade, Atlantic Slavers, and Interracial Marriage on the Gold Coast revealed that African slave traders and Europeans established political and economic ties through marriage. The Portuguese word casare, meaning to marry, served as a connection between them. Initially, West African elites married their wives to European traders in an alliance to control the trade. African marriage rituals were accepted by Europeans who understood their significance. According to Robin Law, the royal elites of the Dahomey Kingdom were aware of the fate of African slaves. Diplomats dispatched to Brazil and Portugal reported back to the kingdom. Some of the elites were enslaved in America before returning home. However, the kingdom opposed enslaving fellow Dahomeans and made it punishable by death. Despite this, they supported slavery. The trade of enslaved individuals across the Atlantic Ocean had enduring consequences for the continents of Africa, Europe, and the Americas. It shaped the economies of the Western Hemisphere and Europe and led to the displacement of millions of Africans from their homeland. The legacy of slavery persists in the Americas and has been a topic of debate and controversy in recent years. It is essential to remember the dark chapter in human history, to learn from it, and strive towards a better future. As we conclude our discourse on the Atlantic slave trade, it is evident that this is a significant subject that demands attention. It serves as a poignant reminder of the atrocities that individuals can inflict upon one another, and the significance of recognizing history in order to progress towards a brighter future. The enduring impact of slavery remains pervasive, and it is incumbent upon us to draw lessons from it and strive toward a more equitable and fair society. We should pay tribute to the millions of lives lost and the numerous families torn apart by this trade, and endeavor to commemorate their memory by working towards a world that upholds the values of freedom, justice, and human dignity for all. Thanks for watching.